On opposite sides of the Atlantic, history was made on January 17th, 2020. In America, Donald Trump was facing his first impeachment trial. And in Germany, Schalke defeated Borussia Mönchengladbach 2-0, their first and last win of the calendar year. For both Trump and Schalke, 2020 was a year filled with losses. But 2021 is a new year, and while Trump may be getting impeached again, Schalke is flipping the script.
But now the counter-attack for Schalke with pace and numbers forward here. It's Arit for Matthew Hoppe, and Hoppe's in for Schalke! Magnificent finish!
Following a hat-trick from 19-year-old American Matthew Hoppe, Schalke beat Hoffenheim 4-0, breaking a 30-game winless streak. Had they lost or drawn the game, they would have tied a 55-year-old Bundesliga record held by Tasmania Berlin. Today we ask, how did one of Germany's biggest teams become historically bad? You saw Schalke's first win this past weekend. Can you walk me through your emotions of watching that win for the first time in nearly a year?
It was an interesting cocktail of jubilation, but also relief.
Jack Mangan is a co-host of the Schalke America podcast.
The team had spent 357 days wandering the Bundesliga wilderness, searching in vain for a win. And every week the fan base tunes in to support the team, trying to maintain the hope that the turnaround is imminent. But every week a little bit more of that hope gets chipped away, and you slowly start to lose the capacity for it. Over time, it kind of builds and slowly kind of crushes you down. And I think this victory has replenished the well of optimism, at least to some extent, at least temporarily. And that's a really nice feeling.
Did you find yourself becoming a little bit more apathetic as the months and weeks, wore on?
Absolutely, and it's something that I've definitely tried to push back against and fight. And every time I find myself falling into that, I try to talk myself out of it. But it is difficult to stay positive. It's especially on the podcast. Week after week, you have to hop on and talk about, find new ways to explain the same mistakes and the same poor performances, and it really is soul crushing over a period of time as long as nearly a full calendar year, which is what this streak was.
But Schalke didn't just win; they won in style, scoring 4 goals. How did they win so convincingly?
In some sense, just by getting back to basics. I mean, Christian Gross hasn't exactly reinvented the wheel here early into his stewardship of Schalke. We saw a compact, well-organized 4-4-2 with selective but effective pressing and a sense of urgency in transition, yielding high-quality opportunities in front of goal and clinical finishing when those opportunities arose. It all sounds very simple and straightforward, and yet it's been a formula that's proven shockingly elusive for Schalke over the past year.
Let's dig a little bit more into it. What was different about this performance compared to previous games, even this season?
There's several things that you could point to, but ultimately, it's 3 main things. It's the lack of individual mistakes. At times recently, even when Schalke have put in decent defensive performances at some point in the match, often multiple points in the match, somebody switches off and allows a breakdown, and the goals are just coming in too easily. There were some shaky moments in this match for Schalke defensively, but overall, far fewer of those individual mistakes, and they're able to keep a clean sheet, which is huge and rare for them. And then also a little bit of creativity in front of goal, which has been lacking, not just this season or last season, but largely for several seasons now. It's not often you see Schalke put up those kind of goal scoring tallies in a match, and so that was huge. And last but not least is maybe just a little bit of luck. I mean, so many times this season, even when we are playing poorly, that there's moments where if 1 or 2 things go your way, you can get that result, and it just hasn't bounced our way often enough recently. And this was one where the breakdowns happened. We took our chances, and they were able to finally break the streak.
How much of that do you think is sustainable? Obviously, luck isn't necessarily something that's sustaining, although I suppose Schalke has been unlucky for quite a while as well.
Well, yeah, you would hope the luck would balance out over time, but I mean, there's really no reason it shouldn't be sustainable. As I said, there's nothing overly complex taking place tactically that should be a system and an emphasis that most professional players should be able to cope with quite well. And the quality of the squad, while perhaps relatively lesser than in recent campaigns is certainly of a level capable of producing the performance we saw again, even if the end result isn't always going to be as stark as the 4-0 scoreline that we saw. But the other thing you have to consider about the sustainability of this is two of the players that were instrumental in this performance, one of which, Matthew Hoppe, is a 19-year-old American who's very much still in the midst of his introduction to first team, top league football. Can you rely on a teenager to consistently bang in the goals and be that threat up front? Well, that remains to be seen. And then also Amina Harit, the mercurial man in the middle of the pitch for Schalke. He's really this human pendulum who swings without warning between being one of the creative forces in the Bundesliga to performances and conduct so poor that he's removed and separated from the first team, with his future at the club very much in doubt. He's somebody who shows an X factor, but also is inconsistent at times. And so he was instrumental in this match, and you wonder if he's going to be able to finally find some consistency on the pitch.
Shade Kolasinac came from Arsenal on loan just this winter. What impact do you think he could have on the team? He's been catching a lot of headlines in the news.
Well, you can't argue with the results, right? First game that Shade Kolasinac is in, it's a 4-0 win for Schalke, so clearly the magic ingredient there. But this is a guy that came through Schalke's youth system, very much a emotional leader on the pitch, and in a big physical presence, and somebody that is a leader, both in terms of what they are vocalizing and in terms of how they conduct themselves on the pitch. Kolasinac went to Arsenal on a free transfer several years ago, and really just didn't have the career there that I think a lot of people hoped or thought that he would. And he's always maintained his ties to Schalke and cares deeply about the club. And so when there was an opportunity for him to get consistent football and also potentially help Schalke avoid relegation, I think it was kind of a no-brainer from him. And so far, as I said, the early returns are looking good.
You described your reactions a moment ago to the win. What was the reaction amongst Schalke fans, and what did you see amongst them?
Very much the same thing. Some of that could be my personal online bubble. Obviously, I'm not over on the ground in Gelsenkirchen. I'm in the Chicagoland area, so much of my interaction with the other Schalke supporters is virtual in that sense. But yeah, it's just this weird mix of I think the standard joy that any supporter has at seeing their team win, but also this incredible sense of relief after throwing off the burden of this winless streak. But simultaneously, there's still the realization that we're in a very serious situation. And so it's not, all sunshine at this point. It's still kind of a cautious approach going forward, I guess you would say, in terms of how hopeful the fan base is.
Before we go into this winless streak and dive into it a bit more, how did you become a fan of Shalk?
I wish I had some incredibly romantic and interesting backstory to that, but unfortunately, it's pretty lame. I remember watching the 2006 World Cup, and that was the event that really sort of captured my imagination and got me interested in the sport. And just early into my explorations of the world game, you're learning about the different leagues, the different teams, and kind of stumbled across Schalke. I enjoyed some of the players that they had at the time, Kevin Karani, guys like that. And, as you slowly learn about the team, you just kind of fall into these things over time. And my passion and support for the club has been building for a number of years now.
For those who might not know a lot about Schalke and maybe just kind of seen them on the Champions League a couple times, what is their place in German football? What is the club most known for within the German landscape?
So Schalke was founded back in 1904 and is named for a district within the city of Gelsenkirchen in Germany's industrial northwest. It's an area with a long history of mining operations, and many of the club's initial supporters, and indeed some of its players, were actually miners themselves, hence one of Schalke's club nicknames, Die Knappen, which is the miners. So that association with the mining history has long been a thing, and those mining values of hard work have kind of embedded themselves in sort of the club ethos. So I think that association is very strong. The player tunnel that they descend down very much is modeled after a mine shaft, so the players are heading down there. It's tied in with the fabric of the whole area. It's also one of the bigger clubs in Germany with over 150,000 club members. And on top of that, it's one of 5 remaining Bundesliga clubs, I believe, that maintain the Verein designation, which is a legal status for registered voluntary associations in Germany. This is how most clubs were organized prior to the 50+1 rule. But since then, most clubs have outsourced their professional departments or otherwise modernized their structure to secure greater investment. The Eingetracht designation is considered, I think, a more pure expression of what a football club is supposed to be in the eyes of a lot of German football fans, and so that assists with Schalke's status as sort of a traditional German club.
Modric made a challenge, but it might come for Untitled. He's in! He's got another! And Schalke have got another lead! And they're one away from winning this tie, would you believe? Class Jan Untitled smashes it in off the crossbar. An inadvertent pass from Luka Modric.
Now, on the continent, maybe most people remember Schalke recently from their Champions League runs with Raúl and Klaas-Jan Huntelaar back in the mid-2010s. They had that big tie against Real Madrid that was quite high scoring. Can you give a recent history of the club from then to where they are now?
You know, it's funny that you mentioned Raúl and Klaas-Jan Huntelaar, just because I think part of the story of the past few seasons has been Schalke coming to terms with how important and difficult to find that kind of caliber number 9 is. It's something that we've been trying to replace and failing to do recently, but it's also been a story of a club kind of desperately trying to hold on to its status as a consistent Champions League or at least European qualifying team, while slowly realizing the seriousness of the financial situation the club has gotten into over the past couple of years as well. So it's a combination of trying to maintain high level performances while not necessarily having the investment and the other circumstances around the team to allow for that.
30-game winless streaks don't just happen overnight. You know, when did things really start to go downhill for Schalke, and why?
I would argue that there were signs of an impending collapse actually as far back as Domenico Tedesco's first season in charge, where Schalke actually finished runners-up to Bayern Munich, a by any standard successful campaign. I think there were signs of some problems to come even back then, but really where the wheels fell off was shortly after the Winterpause last season. Schalke started the Rückrunde with a victory over Borussia Mönchengladbach and then did not win after that. It didn't necessarily start off horribly in terms of some of the performances. They weren't all blowouts or anything like that, but it definitely was headed in the wrong direction. And then once the coronavirus suspension of play took place, it was some of the worst football I think anyone's seen, and it was not competitive.
You mentioned it all kind of started to unravel around the time of the coronavirus. Their last win, was last January, as we mentioned earlier. How did they manage to stay up despite losing 7 of their final 9 games?
I think Schalke managing to maintain their Bundesliga status last season mostly just comes down to how well they played in the first half of the season under David Wagner, which is part of what makes the collapse so strange. They were in or around the European qualification spots for most of the first half of the season, and then sort of out of the blue, it just all fell apart for them.
How surprised were you when you saw that happening? Like, were there any signs in that first half of the season?
Some of the same stuff. There's always been just a little bit of perhaps psychological fragility, a lack of a goal threat. These have been issues in recent seasons, but nothing that would give you any indication that, I guess, a collapse of the kind that we saw was incoming. But I guess the interesting thing is that this has been something of a pattern recently. It wasn't just under David Wagner that something like this occurred. Domenico Tedesco's second season with the club, that the manager prior to David Wagner, he was ultimately sacked in the second half of the season as a result of Schalke slipping down the table and approaching the relegation places. So these kind of like significant collapses have sort of been a recurring theme recently.
In the summer, they loaned out one of their best and most promising players, an American Weston McKennie, to Juventus for 4.5 million euros, and then inserted in there was an obligation to buy if he meets certain requirements. From the outside, why would they do that?
It's largely financial. Schalke have been getting themselves into a pretty precarious predicament financially over the past couple seasons, but I don't really think the impacts of it were really fully felt or even realized by some supporters until the coronavirus suspension of play, which obviously affected so many different industries financially. But suddenly in the wake of that, you're hearing words from the Schalke hierarchy like existential threat.
In fact, as recently as the end of 2019, Schalke's financial records revealed that they had close to 200 million euros of debt. And remember, this was pre-pandemic. This was before...
Obviously, Weston McKennie is a player that you would like to hold on to, but with limited funds and additional squad planning needs, you have to let some of these players go. And he's one of the guys that's going to have some marketability on the European stage, both from the sense that people are trying to get into the North American market and appeal to American viewers, but also that he's a talented player. So, top clubs are going to want him.
It's interesting because, they're known as, one of Germany's biggest teams, and yet they don't really have the finances in this moment of time to kind of get themselves out of, this horrible run of form. And, it's one of those weird situations that doesn't come around really all too often.
Yeah, and I think that's one of the things that's so frustrating for Schalke supporters is that for years we've been hearing about the revenue that Schalke brings in and how they are one of the the highest ranking teams in terms of in all of world football, not just German football, in terms of annual revenue. And so then you kind of begs the question, how do we get ourselves in this kind of situation financially? So yeah, it is unusual that a club with sort of the reputation or status of Schalke really is in these kind of difficulties financially. Yeah, it makes it much more difficult to stay competitive when there's squad overhaul that's needed and the funds just quite simply aren't there to do it.
They've had 4 coaches during this run, which makes you think in some ways that this is actually the fault of the players. How much blame do you apportion to the coaching versus the players?
There's certainly blame to be placed on the coaches, and I think that's the nature of football in general. It's a results-driven business, but I think over time, the sense is that it's less about the coaching and more about just sort of the atmosphere and the psychology of the players. Schalke has long been considered sort of a chaos club or potentially a poison chalice for managers. It's never a club that really seems to settle into a steady rhythm. There's always drama, right? And I think you can talk X's and O's all day and you can get different trainers in with different ideas, but at some point, the players need to realize that they have the quality to win games and they just need to go out and execute it and do it. And I know that's an oversimplification, but yeah, over time, I think the balance of the blame has shifted from coaching to players. I mean, David Wagner, for instance, we talked about how good of a first half of the season that they had under him. And then suddenly it was polar opposite. I mean, David Wagner didn't forget how to coach over the Winterpause. That's not exactly how that works. So there's other things going around from like an atmosphere perspective that I think are affecting things on the field as well.
Are there any other reasons that we haven't mentioned so far for why this run was for so long?
I mean, one possible explanation is just the lack of fans in the stadiums. The Veltins Arena is definitely a venue that can be rocking on home match days. And, the Nordkurve is a huge source of inspiration for the players. And so not having that sort of direct accountability, I think on a week-to-week basis, from the fan base, potentially that could have a motivational effect. But there's also been a lot of controversy surrounding the club, like off the pitch, in terms of, Chairman Clemens Tönnies stepping down amid a racism scandal and other things, the financial situation. It's not just, poor performances on the pitch. It's sort of this whole maelstrom of chaos at the club right now that it bleeds into everything. It seems like it's difficult to kind of separate that out from what's going on the pitch.
Can you go a little bit further into that racism incident that you're talking about?
Yeah. Clemens Tönnies, who was longtime club chairman, made some statements that were deemed to be racist. There was, I think, the sense amongst a lot of Schalke supporters that the actions taken by the club or the apology really wasn't what they would have wanted it to be. And that combined with a different scandal in terms of conditions in his factories, he has ties to the meat industry, ultimately put too much pressure on him to remain at the clubs, and the fans sort of forced him out.
While they've broken this winless streak, they're still in relegation fight. They're in second to last place at the moment. How much optimism is there that they can actually avoid relegation?
The joy over ending this winless streak is tempered by the reality of the situation that the club still finds itself in. You're absolutely right. I mean, we're still in 17th place. We're multiple results away at this point in terms of points accrual from getting out of a table position that could potentially lead to relegation. So the work is still very much all there to be done for Schalke, and it's going to take additional performances sort of in this vein for them to pull themselves out of the situation and secure their continued status in the Bundesliga.
What do you think is the biggest X factor looking forward? You know, if someone just started watching Shalk for the first time this weekend, what's something that they should look for to determine success going forward?
Probably a couple of things I mentioned before, which is just the individual mistakes. If Schalke, particularly on the defensive end, can cut down on those, it's going to keep them in games for longer and give them an opportunity. Too many of the goals that they've conceded have been far too easy for their opponents. They're not making their opponents work hard enough for the victories that they're getting. And then simultaneously, keep an eye on whether or not this kind of offensive spark can continue. As we said, they've also struggled offensively. It's been bad on like basically every area of the pitch that you can look to. So if Schalke can continue to score goals somewhat regularly and cut down on those individual mistakes, maybe they can grind out some more results and secure their place.
If they do get relegated for the first time since 1983, what does that mean for the club?
It's certainly not going to mean anything good for the club if they're relegated. Specifically, we already talked about the financial situation and how serious and grave that situation is. If you were to get relegated and go down to the Zweite Bundesliga, there's going to be a revenue hit from Bundesliga TV revenue that you're no longer going to be receiving. That's only going to further that financial situation. I mean, certainly if you stay up, that kind of revenue is going to help you over time right the ship and fix this. I mean, if they were to qualify for the Champions League again at some point, that would help as well. They've lost those revenues as well. So getting relegated, despite I think what some supporters view as an opportunity to kind of like rebuild and fix everything that's wrong with the club at the moment, is very much a terrifying prospect and could have serious consequences.
Let's speculate for a moment and look towards the future. 10 years from now, how do you think you'll remember this winless streak?
Hopefully, it will be viewed as sort of a moment in time where the club was able to look at itself, curb some of its excesses, and fix some of its internal problems, and sort of reestablish a base as a launching pad to jump forward into the next 10 years and regain some of that esteem and be playing on Champions League nights again.
Jack Mangan is a co-host of the Shalk America podcast, which is where you can find more information about Shalk. The music for this episode was provided under the Creative Commons license by Blue Dot Sessions, and you can find more information about the songs in the episode show notes. This episode was produced by myself and John McKenzie. I'm Josh Schneider-Weiler. Thanks for listening to Football Today.